On the night of the 13th of January 2012, the Costa Concordia cruise ship ran aground off the island of Giglio, west of Italy. Its carcass lay off the Tuscan coast for a year, a grim reminder of one of the most bizarre catastrophes in nautical history, and of the incredible series of blunders that took 32 lives. On the 13th of January 2012, a huge ship lay wrecked just meters from the shore of Giglio. By morning, more than 4,000 people from all over the world were marooned on this island that is normally home to just 600. Now, for the first time, the whole story can be told.
It was a very hard night, a night that time stood still because daylight never seemed to come. We islanders just kept looking at one another and saying, "Is this really happening?" Because it was something unthinkable, absolutely unthinkable.
The mayor of Salzburg in Austria barely escaped on a lifeboat and saw the first bodies being brought to shore.
Auf der Insel selber das war mitten in der Nacht dann, das war was weiß ich, 2.
It was the middle of the night, and until about 2 a.m., people just stood around in the port or just sat down here, there, wherever they could. There was no infrastructure, nothing. This is the point when I first saw the faces of the dead. The bodies were taken from boats and laid onto the dock, then covered by a sheet. So it was already clear at that point that there were victims.
Zugedeckt, aber es war erkennbar, es war da schon erkennbar, dass es Tote gibt.
As dawn rose over Giglio, boats swarmed around the massive wreck. The ship's captain, Francesco Schettino, was taken away and later arrested. The whole story of what really happened that night on the Costa Concordia would only fully emerge later. The $570 million Costa Crociere ship was one of the most luxurious cruise ships on the seas. Yvonne and Roger Pols live in the Black Forest, near Freiburg, Germany. They had never seen anything like the Costa Concordia.
Enormous. You have the restaurants, you have 4 bars, and you have a wellness system, 3 or 4 pools, and you have a sauna. And it's unbelievable.
Totaal zijn er 3 of 4 zwembaden erop. Men heeft een sauna erop. Het is ongelooflijk.
The Costa Concordia was a city that never slept. There were 11 cabin decks, with 26 lifeboats on deck 4. Decks 1 and up were for the 3,000 paying passengers, while 1,000 crew and staff occupied the lower decks.
Wat eigenlijk de boot inhoudt of behelst, laat ons zo zeggen.
The ship as a whole is nothing like what you see in the brochure. It made an impression on me. You arrive in the entrance hall near the ship, and you are standing in front of this enormous, indescribable, metal thing.
Ian Fraser was one of the star entertainers on board.
I've had so much fun on ships. They're a fantastic place to work, a wonderful place to holiday, and yes, I would definitely go back on board.
As the Concordia pulled out of Civitavecchia port on the 13th of January, the route should have taken her safely between the mainland and the small island of Giglio. But Captain Schettino had already ordered a change in the ship's course to do a close sail-by of the rocky island. It was the first of many deadly mistakes.
There's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Among the passengers was the Swedish journalist Jan Mosander.
De första 6 dagarna var fantastiska.
The first 6 days were fantastic. Not a cloud in the sky. We docked in 5 different harbours during the journey. We went ashore every morning for a walk.
Promenerade.
Mosander was a cruise veteran, but it was the very first cruise for 23-year-old Milène Litzler and her fiancé, Michael Blémont. The vacation package was an ill-fated gift for the birthday that was to be her last.
They wanted to be together a bit because Milène and Michael had different jobs. One worked during the night and the other during the day. They spent the last day in Rome, and Milène took a picture of herself in front of the Trevi fountain, throwing coins in for luck.
The ship's classical violinist was Sándor Fehér from Hungary. His family and friends are speaking out for the first time since he died.
I was deeply shocked. I saw it on the television. That's how I heard about it, on the news. Even when the catastrophe was shown, I was sure that nothing serious could have happened to Shani, especially because he'd been working on ships for 10 years.
My name is Jeno Shanya. I was playing with the Bianco Trio on board the Costa Concordia with Sándor Fehér. He was our band leader. On that night, January 13th, when everything started, we were actually off stage for an hour, so we went to our cabin.
Sándor Fehér was a violinist on board. I'd worked with him on a previous contract. He was unbelievable on the violin. The things he was doing, the technicality, the joy of his playing.
Shani worked on ships for over 10 years. In the beginning, he liked it very much, as any young man would, but that feeling gradually faded after a few years. His plan was to go to the United States to work as a violin teacher and also become a member of an orchestra.
As the Concordia left port on the night of the 13th of January, no one could guess what tragic destiny awaited them. As the sun set over the island of Giglio, Captain Francesco Schettino welcomed passengers aboard the Costa Concordia for their cruise around the Mediterranean. At 51, he was an experienced captain. That evening he dined with a Costa-employed Moldavian dancer while his first officer took command. Before leaving port, he had promised his head waiter, who was from Giglio, that he would perform a sail-by salute of the island. The Costa Concordia had done a similar salute of Giglio 5 months beforehand, and all had gone smoothly. The second officer charted the new course, but the ship's charts didn't show the rocks in detail. At 9:34 p.m., Captain Schettino went to the bridge to take command. The dancer and the head waiter went with him. The ship was on autopilot, and the helmsman was on the lookout. Schettino ordered the helmsman to take manual control and set the Costa Concordia to a new course. Then Schettino picked up the phone and called a retired captain from Giglio and asked if it was safe to sail by. Satisfied with the answer, he proceeded. At 9:39 p.m., he took command. As the sequence of maneuvers that doomed the ship began, the unsuspecting passengers enjoyed their last minutes of fun.
Dus wij hadden
First, we had a very, very luxurious dinner. Everything was perfect and delicious and good. Then we went to our cabin, and about 9:30 we went up to the theatre for the show, which was a magician.
My wife and I were sitting in the main theatre, the Athena Theatre. I think there was room for about 800 people, and we were watching the evening's show, which was a magic show, with a magician called Magic Martin.
Captain Schettino increased speed, but, realizing he was too close to the coast, ordered several turns to starboard. At times, the Indonesian helmsman had difficulty understanding. Just 4 minutes after Schettino had officially taken command, the 290-meter-long ship was just 450 meters from the rocks and headed for collision. But a 15-knot northeasterly wind reduced the effect by half. At 9:44 p.m., he ordered hard to starboard, pointing the ship out to sea. Then he ordered port 10, hoping that by pushing her left, it would take her around the rocks. He added hard to port, but, incredibly, the first officer ordered the opposite. Schettino corrected him immediately, but it took 13 seconds for the rudders to adjust. 2 seconds later, the 51,000-ton ship smashed into the rock.
The ship leant violently to the port side, so much so that the can of drink shot across the cabin. I had to hold on to my computer that was sliding off my lap on the bed. The computer was falling off. And there was a very unusual noise that people still refer to, a sort of a dig-dig-dig-dig-dig-dig, which vibrated the ship violently and then stopped.
It was about 15 minutes into the show that we felt this crash and shuddering. At first we thought it was part of the show. Very soon after we heard an announcement over the loudspeaker saying not to worry, it was just an electrical blackout. I turned to my husband and jokingly said, "Yeah, that's what they said on the Titanic too." And he laughed at me.
Hij heeft mij uitgelachen.
5 percre rá egy nagy
We felt a huge blow. It was so powerful that it even lifted up the television. I have been working on ships for more than 10 years, but I have never felt anything like that. We thought that the blow was pretty big and that there could have been some problems. 20 seconds later, all the lights went out in the cabin.
másodpercre elment az összes világítás. A kabinban nem volt világítás.
In just 20 seconds, more than 2,000 tons of water had flooded the engine room up to the crew deck and blown out the electrics panel. The rudders became stuck at 35 degrees to starboard. The bilge pumps and self-righting systems failed. The ship listed to the left. It was a death blow to the Costa Concordia.
DC1, DC2 e DC3 sono allagati, l'acqua continua a salire. Nei pressi del volano del motore. Nei pressi del volano del motore, mi dice. Sta uscendo dal ponte zero l'acqua, comandante.
Schettino phoned the ship's owners, Costa Concordia, in Genoa. What the crisis manager told him is still unclear. Incredibly, no one called a general emergency. The Concordia drifted past the port of Giglio and out into the open sea, as, unbelievably, orders came from the bridge for passengers to make their way through the labyrinth of the tilting ship to their cabins.
¿Tú por qué andas con salvavidas si todo está bien? ¿Tú por qué este?
De sound technician is weggerend. Dan de magician is van het podium gesprongen, is weggerend.
The sound technician ran away, and then the magician jumped down off the podium and ran away and never came back. Then we saw people coming into the theatre with life jackets over their clothes.
Yvonne and Roger Pols went to their cabin on deck 6.
We zijn naar beneden gegaan naar de cabine.
We finally got to our cabin, and that's when we realized that it was very serious. It was dark. A steward came over to us because the key card wasn't working and told us, take your coat, take your life jacket, and then he said to my husband, don't forget your medicine.
Life jacket nemen en tot mijn man heeft hij gezegd, vergeet uw medicamenten niet.
When we came out into the first lobby, people were running. Passengers were coming out of the restaurants, and there it was even more chaotic because plates and food and chairs had been flying around in there.
Där hade porslin och mat och stolar och allt hade ju flugit omkring där i.
The Mozanders went up to their cabin on deck 8 to get their life vests and personal things and stepped out onto their balcony to get their bearings.
Då såg jag 150 meter, kanske 200 meter längre bort.
I saw 150 meters, maybe 200 meters away, lights. It was land. It was the small port of Giglio. So I said to my wife, if things get really difficult here, then we'll have to swim. I came back in from the balcony of the cabin, and there was a total blackout. About half a minute passed, and we managed to get out into the corridor again and down to the muster station. Then in the crowd, people were pushing from the back.
The Coast Guard grew alarmed after receiving calls from the families of crew reporting an emergency.
Buonasera Costa Concordia, cortesemente avete dei problemi a bordo voi? Sì, affermativo, abbiamo un blackout a bordo e stiamo verificando le condizioni. Che tipo di problema? Solamente il generatore, perché i carabinieri di Prato hanno ricevuto una telefonata di un parente di un marittimo che diceva durante il pranzo mi è cascato tutto in testa. No, negativo, abbiamo un blackout e stiamo verificando le condizioni a bordo.
Unconvinced, the Coast Guard scrambled a helicopter to see for themselves. Providence, meanwhile, would come to the rescue. The very same northeasterly wind that had interfered with the Concordia's steering now turned the ship and pushed it back towards the island.
I remember going out on deck and seeing that the land was relatively near and a flotilla of boats was nearby. And again, you just think nothing bad's going to happen here. We're near land. Okay, we're leaning a bit, but my thoughts were we have a show tomorrow night, so we'll be back on board. Make sure you keep your voice warm and don't worry and be focused for the show tomorrow night.
There were still no evacuation orders from the bridge. But by now, passengers could see that the Concordia was taking on water and leaning heavily to the right. So they gathered on deck 4, where the lifeboats were. Many went to the wrong muster station.
Wij zijn naar level 4 gegaan omdat we wisten dat daar de lifeboats
We went to deck 4 because we knew that was where the lifeboats were. It was while we were standing there that we noticed we had a letter B on our life jackets, yet we were standing at muster station A.
En we stonden aan kant A.
Michael and Mylène made their way to muster station B and texted their parents in Paris.
They sent an SMS at 11:15 p.m. saying there was a problem on the ship and that they had their life jackets on and that they had to leave and embark on a lifeboat. When we received the SMS, we were so tired, we didn't see it straight away. We only saw it in the morning, at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Odaálltunk mi is, és akkor jött oda egy olasz hölgy.
We were standing there when an Italian lady asked for life jackets for her kids. Sándor went away and brought back as many jackets as he could carry in his arms. Then he had to put them on the kids because the parents were so terrified that they couldn't do it.
Rakta a gyerekekre, mert a szülőknek annyi jelenlétük nem volt, lelki jelenlétük, hogy a saját gyerekükre ráadják a mentőmellényt.
Yvonne and Roger had to cross the tilting ship.
En dan begon het grote avontuur, want het is niet...
That is when the adventure began, because we had no idea how big the ship really was. We thought it wasn't even 10 meters wide, but it was very broad. And it wasn't level. We could barely stand up, and we had nothing to hold on to.
On deck 4, Yvonne and Roger Pols could see that the lifeboats were full and the staff were having trouble with them.
That was the
first moment when I really felt scared. We could see they were having trouble with the lifeboat and that there was no room on the lifeboats. And that was the first moment we looked at each other and said, is this the end? Is this how our lives end?
Waar ons leven eindigt, ja.
Und es war einfach ein Chaos. Ja, es gab keine.
It was simply chaos. There was no command, no instruction. The uniformed officers were not there, but rather it was the people from the kitchen, the restaurant, the maids, or the men who worked in room service. They helped the passengers a little bit, but they weren't really trained.
Die Zimmermädchen, oder es waren auch Männer, die da im Room Service arbeiten, die haben sich die Passagiere ein bisschen gekümmert. Aber die waren natürlich dafür gar nicht vorbereitet.
And I remember saying to trying to reassure a French passenger, she said, oh, I'm very scared, what am I going to do, what am I going to do? And I said, don't worry, the only time you have to worry is when you hear the general emergency signal. And as I said that, the general emergency signal was sounded. And I said, right, now you need to put your life jacket on.
At 10:33 p.m., nearly an hour after hitting the rocks, Captain Schettino ordered the general emergency. 10 minutes later, his first officer urged him to order abandon ship, but again, he waited. The dream vacation aboard the Costa Concordia had turned into a nightmare for the 4,000 people aboard. When singer Ian Fraser reached his muster station shortly before 11 p.m., the situation was degenerating.
We were leaning so far. Once you get past 20 degrees, launching a life raft on the side that's away from the water becomes almost impossible. And I remember a life raft being launched, deployed, and it stuck on the side of the ship, but they kept lowering it, and it just tilted to the vertical. Full of people, you could hear people screaming, you could hear people falling inside it. All the crew members on the ship watching this were screaming, saying, stop, stop, stop lowering the boat, stop lowering the boat. But they lowered it far too far, and then finally, with it stuck on the side and tilting to the vertical, they finally stopped, and it broke away from the side of the ship and swang and clanged back into the ship. And I remember thinking, this is terrible.
Then they did start winching us down. But the problem was that halfway down we got stuck. The lifeboat got stuck because it didn't have free clearance, but got stuck on the side of the vessel because of the list. And then, for the first time, that's when I became really afraid.
But Giglio residents had no idea of the drama about to engulf them.
I opened my window and saw this lit-up building right in front of me. I called my husband and said, "Come look at this spectacle. Look at this huge, beautiful ship in front of us."
Mario Pellegrini is the island's deputy mayor. He would save many lives that night.
Mi sono precipitato qua in porto, la mia casa dista dall'altra.
I hurried here to the port, which is 10 minutes away from where I live on the other side of the island, and I was amazed to see this huge ship which was tilting 10 to 20 degrees there on the rocks.
Era fuori gli scogli.
Meanwhile, passengers like the young French couple, Mylène and Michael, were unable to board lifeboats on the ship's port side. They were forced to cross the ship, but the other side was overcrowded and would soon slip down into the sea.
Maar wat we gezien hebben, men moet zich dat voorstellen.
What we saw, one must try to imagine. It was unreal. I had to hold on to my husband's coat. Then a member of the crew came over and said, "Fast, fast, run to level 3, quickly, quickly." But it was difficult to go fast, fast, because the ship was tilting so much.
Omdat het schip zo...
and someone shouted, "Come on guys, you need to get off, you need to get off now." So the ship is now listing at 45 degrees. The wall and the floor are at this angle, so you're walking at the bottom of a V.
6 of 7 mensen van crew.
There were 6 or 7 members of the crew that had made a human chain so that we could get up the corridor, and you grabbed a hold of each of their shirts to pull yourself up. We arrived at level 3 and there was a door. My husband went through it, but a woman in front of me fell down and was injured. There was a crew member who had come to help the woman, and he said in English, "She's going down." And I didn't know if he meant the woman or if he was referring to the ship. She is going down.
En ik wist toen niet of hij bedoelde of deze vrouw iedere keer terug zou vallen of dat het schip aan het zinken was. She is going down.
I do not know how I got from deck 3 into the lifeboat. I don't know. What I do know is that while I was on the deck, I saw 4 hands reach out over me and pull me into the boat.
Naar boven komen en die hebben mij werkelijk van het dak in de boot geholpen.
Wir waren eine kleine Gruppe, die überlegt hat, zu springen. War natürlich Chaos.
There was a small group of us that considered jumping. It was chaos. People were packed. There were so many small children and elderly. We thought, let's wait and let them in the boats first and see how the situation develops. It was at that point that we decided that if the ship goes over to the side, we can quickly jump off and swim away from it. But fortunately, a boat came, and I said, "So, this is our last chance to get off the boat, dry and safely." And that's what we did.
Und sicher von Bord gehen können, das haben wir dann auch gemacht.
So we got to the starboard side, the water's lapping, a lifeboat is trying to get to us, but the ship is leaning so far it can't get any closer to us, and it sails away. Quite rightly, it would have been dangerous for it to come any closer. So I'm not putting any blame on that.
As lifeboats began arriving in port, island officials braced for the massive influx of people.
Abbiamo aperto gli asili perché sono dei contenitori di grandi.
We open the nurseries because they contain large halls, and so large rooms that can house a lot of people. We open the churches, we open the schools, because they're heated, and so they could in some way host all these people.
Mario Pellegrini volunteered to go onto the ship to liaise with the captain. A lifeboat took him out to the Concordia's rope ladder so he could climb on board.
E lì mi sono forse subito accorto che quello che potevo fare, quello che era andato per fare, non lo potevo più.
Then I realized that what I had gone aboard to do had become impossible. There was chaos. People were crying. There were people laughing who didn't realize how bad the situation was.
At 12:18 a.m., the ship began turning over. Thousands of tons of water swilled inside the ship as the submerged glass windows broke under pressure. More water rushed in, and as it moved through the ship, pulled people down. According to court documents, this was the most fatal moment of the disaster.
And there's about 30 passengers, 40 passengers, and about a dozen crew by now at the back of deck 4. And what do? You're slipping, you're sliding, you're trying to hold on to something. You can't stay upright. I'm hanging on to a door. As it ended up, the Concordia rested on the rocks and stayed there. But we didn't know. It could have been that the ship was going to suddenly just slide down in seconds, gone. There was a passenger standing at an open gateway, the water lapping at his feet, and he said, "What do I do?" And I remember people said, "Go, go, jump now, go." Myself and Kirsty, Stephen, Joe, and passengers, with our life jackets on, we just jumped.
During this confusion, Schettino got into a lifeboat and left the Costa Concordia. Mario Pellegrini had found the bridge, but no officers. He was headed down a corridor to help others when the ship began to turn over.
There were about 100 people in that corridor. People were yelling, there were screams, crying. It was like what you might expect from a film. That's how it was in that moment.
And the sound stays with you. There are people screaming, and that crunching metallic sound. I know it's a cliche to talk about the Titanic, but it's exactly the sound that you hear in that film is the sound that we heard. Things crashing inside the ship, metal groaning, twisting, and the ship, such a cliche, dying.
Mario and the others were stuck in the heavily tilting corridor when they found a ladder one of the officers had put down.
100 people were massed at the bottom of that step ladder. The scene was quite violent. There was no more chivalry. The idea that elderly and children should go first had disappeared.
All night, Pellegrini worked together with the ship's doctor and the purser, extracting passengers with ropes and ladders from dark, watery corridors.
As we were trying to get them out slowly but surely, we heard shouts. These shouts came from shafts. I call them shafts because they were the central corridors of the ship that went from right to left of the ship. And when the ship capsized, these became vertical shafts, and I heard shouts coming from one of them. I called a purser who said that he had nothing, and then we found a small rope. We opened the trap door and saw the people at the bottom of the corridor calling for help. The water was rising, and many were already in a state of panic. They had looked death in the face.
Swimming away, looking back and looking at that with the funnel towering on you. And I remember thinking, I'm going to swim to safety, but the funnel's going to break off. It was at such an angle, the funnel is just going to shear off and crash into the sea.
As the lives of many were being saved by the tenacity of the few, Giglio residents and Italian Coast Guard began coordinating a massive rescue and recovery operation.
È questa? Guarda dov'è? Eccola qui. È affondata.
At midnight on January the 13th, Italian Coast Guard infrared cameras recorded the Costa Concordia cruise ship partially capsized just off the coast of the island of Giglio. Water was rushing into the ship. Passengers were trapped both inside and on the ship's slippery exterior. Some had swum to shore.
Made it to rocks, and two elderly passengers with life jackets were swimming in the water. And I said, "You're all right," and I pulled them out of the water, and we climbed up a fairly rocky slope. There was no vegetation. And we climbed up and stood on top of a rocky cliff top with by now, about 60, 70 people.
On the outer hull of the ship, I met the officer Canessa, who had laid all those rope ladders to get people down. It was hard to walk on the outer hull, especially because some people needed help, such as the elderly and children.
e ho visto che già scendeva giù la gente.
I saw that the people had begun disembarking and they were coming towards the church with towels and stuff, and they were there on the steps. So we opened the church because we thought if these people had already come off the ship, who knows how many others there were, and we had to find a place for them.
Residents opened up their private homes and helped passengers in their desperate search for loved ones.
Però io pensavo solamente all'inizio, nessuno aveva capito la portata dell'evento, credo.
To begin with, I thought, well, no one understood how big the event really was. I had 2 guest rooms, so I thought I would put 2 people in the guest rooms. In the end, we had about 50 people here.
Avevo una cinquantina di persone alla fine, abbiamo portato a casa.
In Livorno, Coast Guard Commander Gregorio De Falco finally reached Captain Schettino.
Senta, io sono De Falco da Livorno, parlo col comandante? Col comandante Schettino, comandante. Schettino? Sì. Ascolti Schettino, ci sono persone intrappolate a bordo, adesso lei va con la sua scialuppa sotto la prua della nave, lato dritto, c'è una biscaggina. Lei sale su quella biscaggina e va a bordo della nave. In questo momento la nave è inclinata. Ho capito. Che sta facendo, comandante? Sto qua per coordinare i soccorsi. Che sta coordinando lì? Vada a bordo, mi coordini i soccorsi da bordo. Lei si rifiuta? No, non mi sto rifiutando. Lei si sta rifiutando di andare a bordo, comandante? No, sto andando. E mi dica qual è il motivo per cui non ci va. Ci sto andando perché ci sta l'altra lancia che si è fermata. Lei vada a bordo, è un ordine. Lei non deve fare altre valutazioni. Lei ha dichiarato l'abbandono nave. Adesso comando io. Lei vada a bordo. Okay. Ci sono già dei cadaveri, Schettino. Avanti. Quanti cadaveri ci sono? Non lo so. Uno l'ho sentito. Me lo devi dire lei quanti ce ne sono, Cristo. Però, ma si rende conto che è buio e che qua non vediamo nulla. E che vuole tornare a casa, Schettino? È buio, vuole tornare a casa? Adesso va a bordo. E mi viene subito a dire quante persone ci sono. Va bene, comandante. Vada, subito.
But Captain Schettino never returned to his ship. Back on Giglio, coping with 4,000 shipwrecked survivors was a Herculean task.
I was hugely impressed by the inhabitants of the island. It is a small island. There are not that many people. And in the port, even fewer. They were magnificent. They threw blankets and towels from their windows because some passengers were drenched as they had jumped into the water.
Mijn eerste gedachte als ik aan land kwam.
My first thought when I got on land was, well, I looked over at the ship and then I thought, how can one find someone in this mass of people? But he was standing about 20 to 30 meters away from me, and I was glad to see him. Afterwards, he also said he was glad to see me.
Ja.
Voor mij, ik stond op de kaai en had al een paar keren rond.
I was standing on the quay and had already looked a few times around to see if I could catch a glimpse of a well-known face. And then there was the moment that I saw her, 20 or 30 meters away from me. My wife, with a mobile phone in her hand, trying to call me.
Poi invece verso l'una ho trovato una signora tedesca.
Around 1, I found a German woman in a complete state of shock, wet, without socks, without shoes, and her feet were bluish. From 1 o'clock on, we started searching for her husband, who had remained on the ship to help her handicapped friend. It was an endless search, with this mantra, Roter, 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 who was her husband. We were looking for tall men with gray hair. In the end, at 6, we found him in the church. It was terrible. Terrible. Terrible thing.
Come erano vestiti sono scesi. Quindi c'è chi era.
They were dressed exactly the same way they were when they got off the ship. The people who were having dinner were dressed up in evening clothes. And when they arrived in church, there's one bathroom, And there was a lot of women all dressed up in evening dress and lame and high heels.
Lì vedevi tutte queste donne con questi bei vestiti da sera, no? Col lamè, col tacco.
As dawn rose, ferries began taking passengers to the mainland, where the civil defense had begun setting up tents for first aid and shelter.
And
then when the people realized they were on an island, there were scenes of panic because no one wanted to get back on board.
And we spent the night in a church, and people were sleeping in the church, in the local school, in all sorts of buildings they could find. And then the following morning, a ferry left at 8 o'clock, and kind of the last thing you wanted to do was be back on the sea again, but you realized you didn't have much choice.
So we all got together and went down to the ferry that was going to leave at 11. And we were all there hugging and kissing. As you can imagine, they kept blowing us kisses until they disappeared over the horizon. We felt so relieved that this huge mass of people had finally left, and this emergency was finally over. But no, the world came to Giglio.
Il mondo al Giglio è venuto.
The media, investigators, rescue workers, and salvage teams all descended on Giglio, where shaken family members also waited desperately for news of their missing loved ones.
We'd been waiting for news for 2 days, and we were starting to be very anxious to know what was happening. And on Monday morning, I saw the first reports on TV about the divers going into the Costa Concordia, and I began to say, we have to do something. We have to go there because we have to find our children.
És amikor mentünk át, a konzulnő kísért bennünket, a Giglio szigetre megyünk, már föl is szállt.
We were escorted to Giglio Island by the lady consul. We boarded the ferry and were actually heading to the island when she received a phone call about 5 newly found bodies, one of them presumed to be Shani. The ferry turned around and we got off, and we had to go to a hospital in Grosseto to identify him. That was it. No one had been sure whether it was him or not. We had been hoping it was someone else, and that's when I saw him. I had to identify him. That's when I had to face the fact that he was dead.
Tehát nekem kellett azonosítani, és ott szembesültem vele, igen, hogy ő volt.
In the weeks that followed, rescuers dramatically saved 3 more lives and recovered the bodies of more victims. The families of the 32 dead pleaded for justice. Francesco Schettino was arrested and a criminal investigation was launched to find out why the Concordia sank and who was responsible. Removing the precarious vessel from the rocks of Giglio, however, would take more than a year, cost millions, and prove to be one of the most risky and complex salvage operations in nautical history. For months, the massive wreck of the Costa Concordia lay beached off the Mediterranean island of Giglio. The dramatic sight of epic rescues, grim recoveries, and the largest ship salvage ever undertaken. At 9:45 p.m. on the 13th of January 2012, the Costa Concordia cruise ship crashed into rocks as the captain was performing a sail-by salute near the Italian island of Giglio. In minutes, the ship was fatally disabled and beginning to sink, with more than 4,200 passengers and crew on board.
The ship started moving very fast, and so we knew we were going to be underwater quick, and so we just started jumping, and there were 200 people that jumped and swam 100 meters to rocks, and we got up on the shore.
The Costa Concordia was just one of hundreds of luxury liners serving a multi-billion-dollar global industry for cruise vacations. For the first time, the whole story is revealed of the biggest rescue operation and ship salvage of all time. Passengers tell their harrowing stories, and experts reveal how more attention to sea safety might have prevented the disaster.
I am still in contact with lawyers because I gave a written deposition and I intend to give verbal testimony in court because I want to look those officers who left us all there in the eye.
That evening, Costa Concordia captain Francesco Schettino had ordered a deviation from his set course. The Costa Concordia was sailing too close to the coast and too fast. As the evening was getting underway for passengers, Captain Schettino ordered a series of right turns to try to avoid the rocks, but it was too late. A brisk 15-knot wind didn't help, slowing any quick maneuvers that might have changed its fatal course. Professor Sven Dresen of the Department of Maritime Studies at Wismar College in Rostock, Germany, used real data to recreate the accident. Inside the college's state-of-the-art ship simulator, he describes step by step what happened.
Anfänglich wurde ja dann über Autopilot 290 geordert. Im weiteren Verlauf wurde der Helmsman, also der Rudergänger.
At first, the autopilot was set at 290, and then the helmsman was called to take over manual steering, which is normal in this kind of situation.
Im weiteren Verlauf Steuerbord 20, also eine Steuerborddrehung des Schiffes vergrößert.
We continue with starboard 10, then starboard 20, and we have increased the starboard turn of the ship. We have tried to reproduce all the conditions of the time, the light conditions, cloud cover, and wind, which is very important because it was blowing from northeast. Then speed was increased to 16 knots.
The ship's bow cleared the rocks, but realizing the ship's peril, the captain ordered rudders to port to push the stern around them. But it was too late.
Dann versucht das Schiff natürlich sehr stark über Steuerbord zu drehen.
The idea was maybe that a hard turn to port would take the ship around close to the rock, but this was not done, and naturally, that's why it didn't work.
Natürlich genau deswegen nicht funktioniert.
Basta 5 metri dallo scoglio, c'è già
5 meters from the rocks, the water is 30 meters deep, and at 10 meters, that goes to 70 meters depth. The water is really deep, so if you hit a rock, it really means that you have come onto the island. You've crashed into the island. You haven't hit an underwater rock.
Ja, diese Situation hat sich oft dargestellt. Jetzt liegen wir auf Grund.
In fact, no one could have done anything. There were no possible operations that could have helped in this situation, or which could have avoided the accident.
Den knapp verfehlt, oder aber so wie hier liegt fest.
In just 20 seconds, all 6 electro-diesel engines were swamped by more than 2,000 tons of water. Water pushed upwards to the crew deck, where the electrical panel blew out, causing a blackout. When the Coast Guard called, following alarmed phone calls from passengers, Captain Schettino withheld key information.
Buonasera Costa Concordia, cortesemente, avete dei problemi a bordo voi? Sì, affermativo, abbiamo un blackout a bordo e stiamo verificando le condizioni.
Enfin, il y a eu un problème majeur de communication.
And then there was a major problem of communications within the ship itself. Immediately after striking the reef, the passengers were told simply that the ship was subject to an electrical blackout, that the electric generator had broken down, and that once this breakdown had been repaired, passengers could return safely to their cabins.
Ou réparé, les gens pouvaient aisément retourner dans leur cabine.
They told us to just stay in the hallway, not to leave, but stay in the hallway, stay close, wait for everything was under control, that the generator had been broken, and that's why there was a blackout.
Please remain calm. The situation is under control.
With no power and rudders locked, the helpless ship was pushed back to shore by the wind. As the ship listed heavily, some lifeboats became undeployable. Passengers unable to get into lifeboats on the port side made their way down slippery corridors to the starboard side. When all the lifeboats there were launched, they had to go down to deck 3 to get into boats coming back and forth. Survivors described their ordeal just hours after the wreck.
There's water coming on board. There's something wrong if it's tipping like that. So I thought, I just want to get to the surface. But that was chaotic in the hallways, people with life jackets on, the power was out.
Akkor mi elkezdtünk rohanni, mentem le a harmadikra.
So we started running to get to the 3rd floor. But the ship was so tilted that we couldn't go down the regular way. When we got to the stairs, I fell and sprained my ankle and hurt my back. I didn't know then that I had a torn ligament. With great difficulties, I had to find my way to the back areas of the ship on the 3rd floor, and there I was able to jump into the last lifeboat so late that my foot was literally in the sea.
And we were up close. We didn't get on the first lifeboats, and then they were gone, and there we stood, and we made friends with some crew members, and they helped us kind of get around a little area and sneak down a Jacob's ladder.
Un certain nombre également
Life rafts didn't open as they should, when they should open automatically when thrown into the sea. We have photographs and witness reports who say they didn't open.
Témoignages qui disent qu'elles ne se sont pas ouvertes.
At 20 past midnight, the ship began to capsize, trapping dozens of people in the upturned corridors and sucking some underwater. The island's brave deputy mayor boarded the sinking ship to rescue dozens, as Francesco Schettino abandoned them to their fate. Working with the few remaining crew, Mario Pellegrini pulled up survivors from corridors that had tilted over into well-like shafts.
Le operazioni sono andate avanti almeno per
These operations went on for an hour and a half because there were some that were easy to pull up, but others were heavy. The rope was very thin, and the hands, my hands, were all cut. The situation was dramatic and a bit tiring. The last ones had the rope around their waist only, out of hurry to be pulled up. They were completely wet with water. By then they were floating in the water because water had reached that level.
erano bagnati completamente di acqua, ormai galleggiavano nel batta, quindi l'acqua ormai gli era arrivata.
We were actually abandoning ship, so, but they didn't have enough room on the boats for us, so we had to wait. They said they were coming back to get us, and at that point the boat started sinking more and more on the side we were at, and we made that decision at that point that we had to get off. And it's a good thing we did, because the part that is now underwater is where we were standing.
È questa? Dov'è? Eccola qui. È affondata. Ok,
This was the sight that greeted the Coast Guard helicopter pilots, who immediately put a rescue diver onto the ship to winch dozens to safety. Hundreds had made it to the exposed hull for boat or helicopter rescue.
Il primo a salire a bordo è stato un aerosoccorritore.
The first to climb on board was a helicopter rescue man. Our helicopter rescue team members have specialized training. They come down from helicopters and descend on the accident site. This time, they descended onto the ship and gave first aid to the people who were trapped on the ship, terrorized and afraid.
Erano bloccate sulla nave, terrorizzate, spaventate.
Ich habe am nächsten Tag zwei Frauen getroffen, die sind bis 4 Uhr früh auf der
I met 2 women the next day who were there until 4 a.m., until a helicopter rescued them. I met a married couple from Austria, and she was 6 months pregnant, and they had jumped into the water. Thankfully, the baby survived. It was their honeymoon. They did not know if the baby would survive.
10 Meter Höhe, zum Glück hat das Baby überlebt.
32 people had drowned in the waters around the ship and inside the flooded corridors and lift shafts. 3 days after the accident, hope for survivors was rapidly fading. But occasionally, miracles do happen. Desperately fleeing the capsizing ship, passengers massed on the Giglio quayside. Dramatic rescues were underway. After a freezing night in Giglio port, the 4,000 passengers and crew were sent back to Porto Santo Stefano. Newsweek reporter Babi Lazzanado was there when the survivors began to arrive.
We were here about 8:30, 8:45 in the morning, which is when the first ferries were coming in from Giglio, carrying passengers and crew members who were still wet, who were carrying the clothes, wearing the clothes and carrying some of their personal effects, their shoes. There was a woman who had been obviously at a formal dinner on the cruise who was carrying her high-heeled shoes, and her companion had his sort of tuxedo jacket with him. And well, there were a lot of people with minor injuries, with bruises, with blood on them, but most of the people were just freezing.
On Giglio, it was a desperate race against time to save those who were trapped alive.
The
2 Koreans were identified around midnight, and they were at the end of a corridor that had become like a well due to the way the ship was tilting. That's the way it looked. And we heard their voices inside one of the cabins in the dry part of the ship.
Di cui sono state sentite le voci all'interno di una delle cabine nella parte ancora emersa.
Cave divers worked underwater together with climbing teams on the dry parts of the ship to extract them. Incredibly, South Korean school teachers Han Ki-deok and his wife, Jae-hong Hae-jin, had slept through the impact and were trapped in their cabin on deck 8 as water rushed in.
Injury? No. No. Okay.
Pronto, via! Vai! Pronti, via! Vai! Pronti, via! Vai! Occhi dalla voce! Vai! Vai, ultimo, vai! Ultima scorta! No, se no, fermo, se no va fuori forza! Allenta! Molla!
They survived on biscuits and water, clinging to their bed as the sea lapped at their cabin.
It was really amazing because this was 3 days after the actual crash, and nobody had really expected to find any survivors. And then there was a diver who came into the coffee bar where all the journalists were working and said they found someone alive, and we all sort of ran out and we were watching as they took this helicopter and pulled out these 2 South Korean honeymooners and brought them to the shore, and then took them by helicopter again to Grosseto.
The purser was found alive in the dining room, lying on a table with a broken leg. But dozens were still missing, including the ship's violinist, Sándor Fehér, and Mylène and Michael, a young French couple on a romantic getaway. Their families weren't losing hope.
On a su qu'il y avait des bus qui étaient avec des rescapés qui devaient arriver à Marseille.
We heard that there were buses coming into Marseille every hour with survivors, so we began calling the crisis centre in Marseille. We called every time a bus arrived to have news, to find out if our kids were on that bus. They told us they were aboard a bus, but unfortunately we called until Sunday at 1 a.m. and we had no news of the children. No one had arrived in Marseille.
Ils étaient à bord d'un autocar. Et malheureusement, on a appelé jusqu'au dimanche 1h du matin, et on n'a pas eu de nouvelles des enfants. Personne n'était arrivé à Marseille.
When we went to Rome to search for him, well, at first, we went there to find him. I brought 100 posters with his picture to put up for display on the island itself. Because if he survived the accident by swimming ashore, he might have been given shelter somewhere. So when we went there, we were thinking that he must be alive and well, and that we were sure to find him.
The next time Thérèse Fehér saw her son was at the morgue. Milene and Mikhail's families would have to wait weeks before divers located their children's bodies, identified by DNA samples. It was a grueling task for divers who had to explore every corner of the ship, inside and out. This Fire Brigade cave diving unit trains in treacherous inland waters of caves, grottos and rivers to prepare for tough, murky conditions like those in the Costa Concordia. Carlo Zellinotti commanded a fire brigade unit specialized in hazardous cave diving. The team carried extra air bottles and long cords so as not to get lost in the maze of submerged corridors.
This is not a job where you can afford to be reluctant to face scenes that can at times be spine-chilling.
Quando abbiamo iniziato le penetrazioni ci siamo accorti immediatamente dei pericoli.
When we started our penetrations, we realized immediately the dangers that our exploration of the ship would expose us to. Doors were tilted downwards, so tended to close. So we had to make sure they were blocked, because as the diver passed, even if they were open, they might have closed, trapping the diver inside.
Immediatamente dopo potevano richiudersi e quindi bloccarlo all'interno.
Navy assault troops blew out the windows to give divers safer access. As the Costa Concordia's water grew more toxic, divers had to completely isolate their bodies from the pollutants and use helmets with compressed air piped in from the surface.
Perché sapevamo benissimo che all'interno della nave erano presenti in grande quantità.
We knew that there were large quantities. Considering the many passengers and travelers aboard, large quantities of chemical substances and oils. For this reason, we used the surface supply system with the helmets, which protected the divers at least in the more dangerous search operations.
Nelle fasi di ispezione evidentemente un po' più pericolose.
The Coast Guard and Fire Brigade Command Center on Giglio Port was the search and rescue hub. It was here where divers decontaminated from the pollutants they swam in daily. To explore the dark waters around the ship, special units deployed remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, which were guided to objects of interest using ultrasound sensors called scouts. The remote search is managed via computers on the surface.
Questa attrezzatura ci permette di perlustrare.
This equipment allows us to explore the seafloor and gather data with regards to targets. Once the map of the seafloor has been made, we start working with the ROV, lowering this machine here. Once the ROV is in the water, it is traced by the scout. So the ROV operator and the scout operator coordinate with each other and inspect the targets we have selected using the side scan sonar.
Scelto prima con il sistema side scan sonar.
As some died in Concordia's sunken corridors, 1,000 passengers had to slide down the slippery outer hull into rescue boats. It took nearly 6 hours. The official court report on the accident faults both the captain and the cruise company, noting neither ordered an immediate evacuation. Lack of a common language and poor training also played a role. Jan Hassem and his toddler son Halvor survived the Scandinavian Star ferry disaster in 1990. His pregnant wife Christine, however, perished along with 158 others. Today, he and Marine Accident Inspector Arne Sagen lobby for sea safety on behalf of the Norwegian Skagerrak Foundation. The foundation maintains the Costa Concordia disaster reflects larger industry problems, such as a disregard for maritime laws and lack of accountability when accidents happen.
The ship strayed from the route it was supposed to take. The ship sailed in waters where there were shallows they were not aware of and not prepared to manage, even though they could have been. So it was an unnecessary accident.
Første informasjonen vi fikk var at skipet hadde en kaptein som var alkoholiker, kvinnejeger og inkompetent.
The first information we got was that the ship's captain was an alcoholic, a womanizer, and incompetent, according to the shipping company's spokesperson. Then my first thought was, who in the world would hire that man as a captain? That showed that the captain was missing the necessary support and backup from the shipping company, which is the first requirement to do a proper job.
Men det også noe som gjennomgående, noe som generelt, og det jo...
One thing recurring in general is the missing safety culture, that existing laws, regulations and conventions are not well implemented in the industry. We see elements of what has happened on the world's oceans that fit the stereotype of the old Wild West.
Stereotypen fra det gamle Wild West.
If the ship had capsized out at sea, the death toll would have been far higher. While 3,000 got off on lifeboats and tenders going back and forth from ship to port, another 1,000 were rescued off the side of the ship's hull hours later.
You know, this industry has continued to just grow bigger and bigger and bigger. Costa Concordia is not even the largest ship. The largest ship is a 6,000 passenger vessel. The problem here is that these ships are top-heavy. They do this for profit because they know that they can sell a balcony space for much more than they can sell space under or below the waterline. Second problem with these ships is that they are created, designed to keep you shopping on board, to keep you gambling on board, to keep you entertained and using the inside of the vessel. And so it becomes a labyrinth in an accident. These ships become a trap.
On the 15th of February, divers found 5 bodies in the stern of Deck 4. Immediately recognizable was Diana Arlotti, just 5 years old. They had been only minutes from rescue. The final death toll was 32. Now, the race was on to save the island from a potential environmental catastrophe. The island of Giglio is one of Italy's beauty spots, with unique flora and fauna along its rocky coastline. First, the Costa Concordia trapped dozens of passengers and crew inside it. But now, it was also threatening to kill this fragile marine ecosystem.
The negative impact is in front of the eyes of everyone. We have a ship sunken right off the coast of Giglio. The impact was not just an emotional one due to the example given by all the island residents whose behavior was impeccable, but also a material impact that we won't be able to see in its entirety until this operation is complete and the ship has been taken away from Giglio.
Costa called in a Dutch company specialized in heavy oil removal. Smit is one of the world's leading salvage companies and made headlines when it helped raise the Kursk nuclear submarine from the Barents Sea. They hired a local company for support. The Neri family has been in the Italian ship salvage industry for nearly a century.
L'immagine era un'immagine surreale, quasi impossibile da immaginare.
The picture was surreal, almost impossible to imagine. The sight filled me with sadness, and to see the body of the ship like that was really dreadful. The level of risk was high because we didn't know how stable the ship was, nor did we know how solid the ship itself was, nor whether it was going to slip to the sea floor, and whether the rocky shelf would support the ship.
Draining the oil from the cold, sunken ship was a hard task.
Het systeem wat we hebben gebruikt voor het verpompen van de olie.
To pump the oil, we use a system called hot tapping. This technique involves 2 stages.
First, a template is attached to the steel hull and 4 drill studs are inserted. Then the flanged mill head is bolted on. The circular saw cuts into the hull. The flange is sealed. Pipes are attached. Now oil can be pumped out.
Nou, omdat het schip een behoorlijke slagzij had en nog steeds heeft over stuurboord.
The starboard tanks were underwater. This meant we had to make a hole in the side of the ship to allow the divers and their equipment in. The hole was made in the double bottom, an empty space near the tanks. The double hole was very narrow, about 1.4 meters if I remember correctly. As you can see, this piece alone is more than a meter long. It is therefore very hard to handle the equipment and position it correctly.
Om dit dan te manoeuvreren en om dat dan nog in de hoogste en in de juiste stand te krijgen, dat is erg moeilijk.
Bulky suits and helmets hampered the divers.
We gebruiken altijd de Kirby Morgan duikhelm.
We always use the Kirby Morgan helmet with an umbilical cable. The umbilical carries the air the diver is breathing, but also contains the power feed for the video camera and the diving light mounted on the helmet. This is a helmet used by our divers. I have to say it weighs a lot. In the water, it becomes a bit lighter, but the equipment used by the divers is very heavy, and with all this weight, they have to work in the most difficult situations.
Een enorme hoeveelheid aan gewicht wat ze onder water mee moeten dragen. En waar onder die omstandigheden moeten ze...
Removing the whole ship would take more than a year, but by mid-April, the oil removal job was done. The islanders had grown attached to the men and women who had come to save their shores from a possible environmental catastrophe.
E allora erano contenti poi alla sera questi olandesi
In the evenings in February and March, the big Dutch workers sat at bars with their orange overalls, big and blonde, drinking beer, and the old people would say, "Well done," because you have done a good job there. That's Giglio. That's the way they are. When they see people working, they are happy. Sorry, I get emotional.
Sì, il momento della partenza è stato un momento molto particolare per tutti noi.
The moment of departure was a very special moment for all of us and for the operators who were leaving, because most of the people of the port came down to the quayside, waving flags and tablecloths and sheets from the windows, honking the car horns. It was a moving moment, a reciprocal exchange of thanks between the islanders and us.
Di reciproco scambio di gratitudine tra l'isola e noi.
In January, Carnival awarded the contract for removing the ship intact to Florida giant Titan, paired with small Italian company Micoperi. It was a massive job worth $450 million.
Però l'esigenza della tutela ambientale ha imposto un recupero.
The need to protect the environment requires the ship to be kept intact. As a result, we know the ship is now stabilized and held back and embraced by steel cables that hold her steady and stop her from sinking to the bottom. Then the ship will be righted and refloated and then moved, taken away to another place.
Il pericolo che possa scendere verso il fondo, e questa nave dovrà essere raddrizzata per poi trovarsi in posizione di galleggiamento ed essere trasferita, portata via in un altro luogo.
Titan called in world-renowned salvage master Nick Sloan. It is the biggest and most complex salvage of his career.
Yeah, this is basically everything you've ever done before put together, but then extrapolated for the size. I mean, she is huge. She's almost three football fields long. The platforms we're going to put underneath, each one weighs 1,000 tons. They'll be bigger than a football field. So everything is just completely bigger than ever before.
The ship lies close to the shore, but just a few meters from an underwater cliff. It is balancing precariously on two small granite outcrops that cause the steel to bend in the middle, weakening the hull and threatening to break it in two. Giovanni Ceccarelli is a marine engineer who designed the America's Cup contender Mascalzone Latino. With Micoperi, an Italian company specialized in gas and oil platforms, he hatched the revolutionary plan for removing the massive ship in one piece.
La nave pesa 45.000 tonnellate.
The ship weighs 45,000 tons, and today, with the water in it and with the equipment on it, it will weigh around 60,000 tons. We have to remove and therefore rotate 60,000 tons and rotate it from 65 degrees list to the vertical.
There are 4 phases: stabilizing and anchoring the ship, pulling it upright, attaching ballast tanks so it will float, and towing it away. The project hinges on the amazing lifting power of hydraulic pulleys known as strand jacks. Workers first stabilized the ship with steel cables and strand jacks attached to concrete blocks anchored to the sea floor. To do this, divers used heavy machinery and giant drills to bore 16 meters into the granite rock to install 12 anchor blocks. Chains are attached on one side to these concrete blocks and pass under the hull to the other 48 strand jacks fixed to the ship. This harness keeps the ship from slipping over the precipice and will be used to right it when all the pieces are in place.
The idea is we're going to roll her upright and then add buoyancy around her to refloat her. Because of the bottom subsea profile of the rock, it's very similar to the mountain, carries on underneath her. If we rolled her upright without having a platform, she would keep on rolling and disappear.
The second phase involves attaching massive ballast tanks filled with water, called sponsons, to the exposed side of the ship. It will then be rotated to the vertical using the weight of the tanks, and even more strand jacks attached via cables and chains to steel platforms, tailor-made as a cradle for the Costa Concordia. To be certain she doesn't slip down into the sea, 100 divers are building a concrete retaining wall beneath the ship's hull.
Then we add the buoyancy to the port side and the beddy lines underneath her. And by the time the platform is on place, then use pulling machines, hydraulic pulling machines, to roll her onto the platform. And we bring the buoyancy onto the starboard side and refloat her.
Once righted, ballast tanks will be attached to the other side. The hope is that when the ballast tanks are emptied, the ship will float. Even if it does, that won't be the end of Costa Cruises' troubles. Nearly a year after the Costa Concordia sank off the Italian island of Giglio, the immediate tragedy has passed, but a huge task remains: the world's largest ship salvage. Workers toil night and day to stabilize the ship, as winter storms threaten to sink it once and for all.
Every wave that breaks against the ship does something to it. As a result, it is getting weaker. The submerged part of the ship is very badly damaged, and every day they monitor the cuts and breakages that the ship may have, and we try to keep abreast of all these elements in our planning. Like a patient who is sick, we constantly carry out analysis.
The ship is deteriorating, but there are other obstacles too. Beneath the sandy sea floor lies a layer of granite.
On the offshore side, that's the large diameter drilling, and obviously because of the angle of the slope, it's very difficult to get the drill to bite into the granite. Granite is the hardest rock to drill into, so it's twice as hard as limestone or sandstone, and that with the angle gives us problems as well.
As dawn rises over the island, a huge floating accommodation platform is being towed into place, with lodging for over 100 salvage divers who risk their lives every day.
So we're ready for trauma, we're ready for diving accidents, but obviously when you're talking about big shackles, big chains and the angles, then crushed fingers, you're going to get those type of injuries. With 450 people, you can expect one injury a week, so we don't want to have any serious injuries. At the end of the operation, everyone has to go home in one piece.
But as autumn turned to winter, delays had already begun to set back the long salvage. 1 year has passed and the ship has only just been stabilized.
Diciamo che la figura generale del progetto è rimasta la stessa.
Let's say that the overall principle of the project is the same, but it has changed where recalculations were necessary to develop the design premises. This has led to a delay in the work because we had to stop a moment to recalculate in order to guarantee the safety of the task underway. So, rather than a delay, I would call it a tuning. The platforms themselves, according to the changes in our calculations after we had moved the anchor blocks and had to move the position of the platforms, well, these changed in number and type.
Spostando le piattaforme cambiavano sia in numero che tipologia.
We're building buoyancy tanks, so those buoyancy tanks, each one's 11 stories high. The larger ones are over 500 tons each, and the platforms and the sponsons together, we've got over 23,000 tons of steel being fabricated around Italy. So it's 5 shipyards plus 3 fabrication facilities, and that on its own is quite a logistical operation.
Islanders worry the troubled project could drag on into next summer's tourist season.
Yes, the ship is there. Yes, that's true. And we have all done what we had to do. We can be proud of ourselves. But enough is enough. The sooner it is removed, the better. That's the idea.
Then, perhaps, survivors can begin to find closure. Many still suffer anxiety from the accident.
A number of passengers saw people die after jumping into the sea from the 5th or 6th deck, and who came up as lifeless bodies. There were those who were blocked in lifts or in corridors. A number of survivors heard people scream as they died. There are as many individual situations as survivors. This anxiety, these situations, cause post-traumatic stress that is very strong.
The woman who was in the lifeboat that fell basically after it had been suspended on the upper side of the ship was describing how she saw a body in the water. She didn't know at that time if the person could have been saved. She wanted to go back. It was dark. It was by then they were experiencing a lot of trauma and shock, but she said she thinks about it every day.
But Costa and their parent company, Carnival Cruise Lines, have not treated all survivors equally.
We were conferring with Costa all along. The meeting was arranged to take place at my lawyer's office. We were all sitting there, and their lawyer didn't show up. We were only told at the last minute that he called off coming here, that Costa was not willing to negotiate with us.
Nem akar velünk tárgyalni.
To force the company to the bargaining table, lawyers in France and the US threatened to have their ships seized in the port of Marseille and the Gulf of Mexico. In this exclusive film, US Marshals serve a court order on a ship's captain in Galveston, Texas.
All right, sir, we're here to execute a court order. We're seizing this vessel.
When you step on one of these Carnival cruise lines, when you pass the gangplank, you have left your country behind. You have stepped into a new country, and I call it the nation of Carnival.
Január ótától, mikor hazajöttünk rá.
2 weeks after we came home in January, we received 458 euros. 9 months have passed since, but Costa is not taking any notice of us. We haven't received our wages. They paid nothing for our lost gear and instruments.
Well, we intend to prove that the captain was negligent, which of course he was, but we're also going to prove that the companies, the cruise companies, were negligent, grossly negligent, in that they did not train the people properly, the crew members. No one died in the actual collision. It was the aftermath that people died in.
On voudrait absolument que le commandant ait une partie.
We want to see the commander and some of his officers in prison for the wrong they have done. They have killed 32 people, including our children, and destroyed the lives of dozens of people. Justice needs to be done. It has broken our lives and the lives of Michael's parents and Milene's brother's life. It's hard to say, but justice needs to be done.
1 year has passed since 32 people died in the wreck of the Costa Concordia. Sometime in 2013, the ship is expected to be towed away, and the captain, officers, and owners will stand trial. But the island will never be the same. Below the rock that sank the massive ship lies a statue of the Madonna, where divers lay wreaths of flowers to honor victims of the sea. Innocents betrayed by machine and man.